3 bins stood in a row at the edge of the mill yard, each one labeled in black paint, each one already spoken for. A truck backed under the first bin before the auger even started turning. Another driver leaned against his trailer at the second bin, checking his phone, waiting on a load he had already paid a deposit toward. The third bin fed a smaller truck headed to a buyer 2 counties over, who took every ton the mill could spare. Malik Marbury stood at the scale house window with a clipboard, watching the whole yard move like it had been choreographed. The mill manager, Wendell Hoskins, walked up beside him and looked out at the same scene. "Where's this load going?" Wendell asked, nodding at the coarse bin. Malik didn't even glance at the paperwork. Which screen did it come off? Wendell almost smiled. 3 years earlier, that same corner of the yard had been nothing but a mountain of cracked kernels and dust, sitting there because nobody wanted to pay to move it. The story of how it changed started with a boy who noticed something everybody else had stopped seeing. Malik was 19 that first summer, working the afternoon shift at Hoskins Grain in the flat corn country of northwest Missouri. He split his hours between loading trucks at the mill and helping his Uncle Ray run 40 head of cattle on a lease 3 miles down the county road. The cattle operation was barely holding together. Feed prices had climbed 2 years running, and the lease payment on the pasture ground was due every spring whether the calves sold well or not. Malik's mother worked at the hospital in town, and her hours had been cut back after a slow winter, which meant the family didn't have much room for surprises. He wasn't chasing a fortune. He wanted enough extra money to help cover feed through the winter and maybe put something toward a used stock trailer that didn't have a bad axle. At the mill, Malik's main job was simple. Trucks came in loaded with corn, dumped into the pit, and the corn moved through drying, cleaning, and storage before it went out again as whole kernel product. Somewhere in all that handling, a portion of every load came out broken. Kernels cracked in the dryer. Kernels shattered going through the leg. Fine material sifted out at the cleaner and piled up under the screens like sawdust. Wendell Hoskins had run the place for 11 years, and to him, broken corn wasn't a product. It was a problem. Nobody pays good money for cracked corn when whole corn's already everywhere. He told Malik more than once, usually while pointing a thumb at the growing pile behind the dryer. Some weeks the mill paid a hauler to take the screenings away just to keep the bins from backing up. Other weeks it went out cheap in mixed loads to whoever would take it, no questions asked about what was actually in the load. Malik didn't think much of it at first either. He'd shoveled fines off the floor plenty of times without a second thought. But one afternoon in late June, a farmer named Otis Reddick pulled into the yard looking for cracked corn specifically for his feeder cattle, and Wendell waved him toward the discard pile like it was doing him a favor. Otis dug through it with his hand, frowned at the dust that came up with every scoop, and left without buying anything. A week later, a different buyer showed up asking for something finer, almost powder-like, for a small poultry operation outside of town, and Wendell sent him to the same pile. That buyer didn't want dust either. He wanted a clean, uniform fine fraction, and what he found instead was a mess of everything mixed together. Malik started paying closer attention after that. He noticed that Otis wanted big, rough chunks with some structure to them, something his cattle could work through slowly. He noticed that the poultry buyer wanted something almost the opposite, fine and dry, but clean, with none of the dusty grit that came off the cleaner screens. He noticed a third kind of customer too, a small feed mill 2 towns over that didn't care as much about size, but cared a great deal about moisture, because wet material clogged their mixer and cost them downtime. 3 different buyers, 3 different wants, and one pile that tried to be all of it at once. That was the first idea that stuck with him. The mill wasn't short on demand. It was short on organization. Malik decided to test it himself before he said anything to anyone. He asked Wendell if he could buy 1 full truckload of the mixed screenings at the going scrap rate, and Wendell shrugged and told him to have at it. Malik borrowed his uncle's old flatbed trailer, hauled off close to 18 tons of mixed broken corn, and tried to resell it straight to a couple of local cattle feeders as cheap feed corn. It went badly almost immediately. The load had too much dust mixed through it, and the dust settled at the bottom of the trailer during the drive, turning half the load into something closer to powder than kernels. Moisture was inconsistent too, higher in some pockets than others, which meant part of the load had already started to warm up by the time he unloaded it. One buyer took a look, ran his hand through it, and flatly that his cattle would sort through it and leave half of it in the bunk. Another said the fines would bridge up in his feed wagon and jam the unloading auger. Malik ended up selling the load for barely more than what he paid, after factoring in fuel and his uncle's time hauling it. He broke even at best, and he'd spent a week's worth of evenings doing it. Uncle Ray wasn't shy about his opinion. "Boy, ain't nobody built anything selling sweepings," he said, shaking his head as they washed out the trailer bed. It stung, but Malik didn't argue. He knew Ray was half right. Nobody built anything selling sweepings because sweepings weren't a product. They were an accident. What he needed wasn't a pile. He needed a pile that had been sorted into something a buyer could actually plan around. Over the following weeks, Malik started spending his mill breaks differently. Instead of eating lunch in the break room, he'd walk out to the discard area with a 5-gallon bucket and a couple of old window screens he'd salvaged from his mother's garage, and he'd run small batches of the mixed material through them by hand. What came out surprised him. The coarsest fraction, the big cracked chunks that stayed on top of the widest screen, was clean enough and dry enough that it looked almost like something you'd see in a bag of scratch feed. The medium fraction, smaller broken pieces that passed through the first screen but stayed on a finer one, was drier and less dusty than he expected once separated from the rest. The bottom fraction, the true fine material and dust, was still a mess. Too much of it was powder fine, prone to clumping if it got any moisture on it at all, and not worth much to anybody except maybe as filler. He labeled his buckets in grease pencil. Coarse, medium, fines. It wasn't scientific, but it was the first time anyone at that mill had looked at the broken corn as 3 different things instead of one. Malik brought a sample bucket of the coarse fraction to Otis Reddick the next time he saw him buying whole corn at the mill. Otis ran it through his fingers, held some up to his nose, and asked how consistent Malik could keep it. Malik told him the truth, that he was still figuring that part out, but that he could bring 5 tons the following week if Otis wanted to try it in a test batch for his feeder pen. Otis agreed, mostly out of curiosity, and told him he wasn't paying full corn price for it, but he'd pay a fair price for something usable. Malik spent the next several days screening material by hand after his mill shifts, filling feed sacks with the coarse fraction, checking each batch by eye and by feel for dust and moisture before he bagged it. It was slow, unglamorous work, done mostly in the evenings under a yard light with his cousin Dante helping shake screens. When the 5 tons went out to Otis's place, it held up. The cattle worked through it without leaving piles of dust in the bunk. Otis paid him on time and told him he'd take more the next month if the quality stayed the same. It wasn't a fortune. The whole load cleared him a few $100s after his time, but it was proof that the idea worked when the material was actually sorted first. A few weeks later, the small feed mill that had complained about moisture problems came back through, and Malik offered them a batch of the medium fraction instead of the coarse. He'd learned by then that the medium material, once cleaned of dust, dried a little more evenly, and its smaller particle size worked better in their mixer without clogging. They tested a small batch, liked it, and started asking for a regular delivery every other week. That was the moment the pattern became clear to him. The mill had been pricing the whole pile by its worst fraction, treating good material and bad material the same because nobody had bothered to separate them. Once separated, the coarse fraction was worth more to Otis than it had ever been worth as scrap. The medium fraction was worth more to the feed mill than it had ever been worth in a mixed load. The dusty fines stayed exactly what they'd always been, low-value material with a narrow market, useful mostly as filler for a buyer who didn't care about quality and paid accordingly. Malik wasn't turning worthless material into gold. He was matching each piece of it to the person who actually wanted it. Word moved slowly through the mill yard, the way word does in a small operation. A couple of the older loader crew ragged on him at first, calling him the sweepings boy and joking that he was going to get rich selling dust. Wendell mostly stayed out of it, though Malik caught him watching more than once when a buyer came specifically asking for the graded stuff Malik's been putting out. When Malik asked the bank in town about a small loan for a used vibrating screen he'd found listed by a retiring seed cleaner 2 hours west, the loan officer looked over his numbers, a handful of months of modest sales, mostly to 2 buyers, and told him it wasn't enough history to lend against. Malik didn't argue that one either. He kept screening by hand, kept filling orders, kept writing down every batch's weight and buyer in a spiral notebook he carried in his back pocket. By the fall of that first year, he had 2 steady customers and a growing feel for which fraction went where. It was modest. A few $1,000s for the season, after fuel and sacks and his own labor, nothing that looked like a business yet. But the notebook was filling up, and so was his understanding of what he was actually selling. Going into the second year, demand started outpacing what Malik could screen by hand in his spare evenings. Otis wanted a standing weekly order instead of occasional loads. The small feed mill wanted the same. A third buyer showed up that spring, a man named Curtis Aldridge, who ran a modest retail feed store and wanted a fine, clean fraction to blend into a budget wildlife feed mix he sold to hunters stocking deer feeders. Malik realized the fine's fraction, the one he'd almost written off as worthless, had a real home after all, as long as it was screened clean of true dust and kept dry. Not every load of fines qualified. Some batches were still too powdery, too prone to clumping, and those he set aside and let the mill haul off as before, because pretending they were sellable would have cost him a customer's trust the first time it clumped in a hopper. That distinction mattered to him more than most people realized. He turned down 2 loads that spring because the moisture readings were too high, telling Wendell to send them out with the regular waste hauler, instead of trying to force them into a market that wasn't there. It would have been easy to tell himself that any broken corn was better than none. But Malik had already learned that lesson the hard way with his first mixed load, and he wasn't eager to relearn it. With 3 buyers now and growing tonnage, Malik scraped together enough saved money, plus a small loan his uncle co-signed against the cattle operations equipment, to buy that used vibrating screen unit. It wasn't much to look at, rust around the frame and a motor that needed a new belt, but it could run through material 5 times faster than the window screens ever could. He set it up under a lean-to at the edge of his uncle's property, close enough to the mill that hauling was short and cheap. He hired his cousin Dante part-time to help run it and load trucks, the operation's first real employee. For the first time, Malik started keeping separate storage. 3 old grain bins Ray wasn't using anymore, one for coarse, one for medium, one for the clean fine fraction, each one marked with a painted sign. It felt, for the first time, like a real operation instead of a side hustle. That was around the time the big order came in, and it was also around the time Malik made the mistake that nearly cost him everything he'd built. A regional livestock nutrition company, sourcing feed ingredients for several feedlots across the county, heard about Malik's coarse-grade product through Otis and reached out directly. They wanted 40 tons delivered over 2 weeks, a volume far bigger than anything he'd handled before, and the kind of order that could set him up with a real anchor customer going into year 3. Malik said yes before he'd fully checked his coarse bin inventory. When he actually ran the numbers, he was short. He had enough coarse material for maybe 2/3 of the order, with the rest of the mill's recent output running dustier than usual because of a wet stretch of weather that had thrown off the drying process. He had a choice in front of him, and he knew exactly what the honest choice was. He could call the buyer, explain the shortfall, and either delay the second half of the order or offer a reduced tonnage. Instead, thinking about how much the contract could mean and not wanting to look unreliable on his very first large order, Malik blended a portion of the dustier, lower-grade material into the shipment to make up the tonnage. He told himself it was close enough. It wasn't. Within days, the feedlot manager called, furious. The dust content had caused the material to bridge in their overhead bins, jamming the unloading auger twice in 1 week and costing them labor hours to clear it by hand. Cattle had sorted through the ration, leaving the dustiest portions untouched in the bunk, which threw off the consistency of the whole feeding program. The buyer rejected the remainder of the order outright and demanded compensation for the 2 days of downtime the clogged auger had caused. Malik drove out there himself, looked at the mess in the bunk and the frustration on the manager's face, and didn't try to make excuses. He admitted the material was outside spec and that he'd known it going in. He refunded a portion of the payment, covered the cost of the return trucking on the rejected tonnage, and lost nearly all the profit margin the contract would have given him. Worse than the money, word got back to the small feed mill that had been buying his medium fraction, and they cut their next order in half, wanting to see if the problem was isolated before trusting him with a full order again. It was the lowest point of the whole thing, sitting in his truck outside the feedlot that evening, running the numbers on what the mistake had cost him. But it clarified something for him that no amount of steady growth ever would have. The problem hadn't been a shortage of corn. The mill produced broken corn every single day, more than he could ever use. The real problem was that he'd promised a specific grade and then substituted a different one the moment it was inconvenient, and that broke the one thing his whole business depended on, which was a buyer's ability to trust exactly what was in the load before it arrived. From that point forward, Malik ran the operation differently. He stopped thinking in total tons and started thinking in tons by grade. Every batch that came off the screen got logged with a date, a moisture reading, and a lot number written on a whiteboard, nailed inside the lean-to. He set a firm rule for himself and for Dante that no grade would ever get blended with another grade to hit a tonnage number, no matter how tempting the order. If he didn't have enough of a grade to fill an order, he told the buyer the truth and offered a partial delivery or a delayed one. And more often than not, the buyer respected the honesty more than they would have respected an excuse after the fact. He started running simple moisture tests on every batch before it went into storage, using a cheap handheld meter he bought secondhand, rejecting anything that ran too wet before it ever had the chance to spoil in a bin. Loads that were contaminated with foreign material, or too moldy, or simply too far gone, went straight to the mill's regular disposal hauler, no different than before. He wasn't interested in pretending every scoop of broken corn was usable, because he'd learned that one bad load could undo months of trust. By the middle of year 2, the system had structure to it that hadn't existed before. Word of the more disciplined operation reached Wendell, who had watched the whole saga unfold from behind the scalehouse window, including the feedlot disaster and Malik's slow rebuild afterward. Wendell called Malik into his office one afternoon that fall, and for the first time, he wasn't skeptical. "You're moving more broken corn out of my yard than my own trash hauler does," Wendell said, sliding a rough proposal across the desk. The mill agreed to start separating certain fractions at the source instead of letting everything dump into one pile, using an extra chute the cleaner already had but had never bothered running separately. In exchange, Malik committed to scheduled pickups twice a week, guaranteeing the mill wouldn't have bins backing up with material nobody wanted sitting around. He paid the mill a better rate than they'd have gotten from a disposal hauler or a cheap bulk sale, and the mill saved money on hauling fees and freed up space that had been eaten up by an ever-growing waste pile. It was the first formal agreement of its kind the mill had ever made for its screenings, and it changed the economics of the whole operation almost overnight. With a steadier, cleaner supply coming directly off the mill's own equipment, Malik's grades became more consistent than they had ever been when he was hand-sorting a mixed pile after the fact. Going into year 3, Malik added a second source, a smaller elevator 40 minutes east that processed less corn overall, but had the same broken kernel problem and no buyer for it at all. He worked out a similar arrangement there, smaller in scale but enough to smooth out supply during weeks when demand outpaced what the home mill alone could produce. By then he had 4 regular buyers and a rotating list of smaller one-off customers, plus a standing relationship with the livestock nutrition company that had rejected his first big order, who came back a season later once his reputation for consistency had rebuilt itself. The bank that had turned him down 2 years earlier approved a modest loan for a second screening unit, this one newer, based on 2 full years of documented sales and a stack of invoices that told a much clearer story than his notebook ever could. Customers started reserving allocation in advance instead of waiting to see what was available. Otis locked in a standing weekly order for the coarse grade months ahead of time. The feed mill that had cut its order after the bad shipment came back with a full weekly contract once its trust rebuilt, plus a request to be first in line whenever the medium grade ran tight. More than once a new buyer called wanting the coarse grade only to hear Malik tell them, plainly and without apology, that the grade was already committed through the following Thursday, and the next opening wasn't until the week after. It wasn't a boast when he said it. It was just where the operation had landed. By the end of year 3, the business was doing a little over $400,000 in annual revenue, spread across trucking, screening costs, moisture testing, insurance, labor for Dante, and a second part-time hire, and equipment upkeep that ate into the number more than people who only saw the revenue figure ever assumed. Roughly 2/3 of that revenue came from the graded corn itself, and the rest came from delivery fees and the standing weekly contracts that paid a little extra for guaranteed tonnage on schedule. The margins were real but not enormous, the kind of business that rewarded discipline more than luck, and Malik understood that better than anyone, having lost a chunk of his first big contract to a single bad decision he'd made under pressure. He didn't dream about turning it into some sprawling empire. He thought mostly about keeping the grades clean, keeping the promises he made to buyers, and keeping the trucks moving on schedule. On the afternoon that brought the story back to where it started, Malik stood at the scale house window next to Wendell, watching the yard work exactly the way it was supposed to. The coarse bin fed Otis's driver, who pulled away with a full load bound for a feeder pen that would have it in the bunk by morning. The medium bin loaded out to the feed mill's truck, right on schedule, right on spec, no complaints waiting to happen this time. The fine-grade bin sent its load toward Curtis Aldridge's store, clean and dry, headed for a wildlife feed blend that had nothing to do with dust or waste at all anymore. Off to the side, in a small pile that never grew very large, sat the material that hadn't made any grade at all, too wet, too contaminated, too far gone to be anything but what it always was, waste, and Malik never pretended otherwise. The waste hauler still came through once a week, but the pile waiting for him now was a fraction of what it used to be. Small enough that Wendell barely thought about it anymore. Ray drove out that evening to drop off a part for the second screening unit, and he stood at the edge of the yard for a while, watching the last truck of the day pull out under the coarse bin. He didn't say much, just looked at the 3 labeled bins and the empty stretch of ground where the old mixed pile used to sit year-round, filling and refilling with nobody quite sure what to do with it. Never thought sweepings could look like that, he finally said, more to himself than to Malik. Malik didn't answer with a speech. He just checked the whiteboard one more time, confirmed Thursday's course grade allocation against Otis's standing order, and walked back toward the scale house to close out the day's tickets. Behind him, the mill yard sat quiet in the evening light, the old pile of broken corn nowhere to be seen, because every pound of it already knew exactly where it was going before it ever hit the ground.